The man on the stage, Dr. Alistair Finch, was a monument to his own ego, cast in tweed and polished leather. He moved with the predatory grace of a creature who had never been told no, his voice a rich, resonant baritone that filled the cavernous lecture hall of the International Linguistics Institute. The air, thick with the scent of old paper, floor polish, and the faint electric hum of anticipation, seemed to bend around him. He was not merely speaking. He was conducting an orchestra of adulation, and the assembled academics, researchers, and students were his rapt, willing instruments. His lecture, titled The Anthropocentric Fallacy, Deconstructing the Myth of Animal Language, was the symposium's keynote, and he was delivering it with the theatrical relish of a master showman. In the third row, almost lost in the tiered seating, Alara sat perfectly still. She was an anomaly in this temple of human intellect. Her clothes were simple, functional, made of durable canvas and soft wool, a stark contrast to the tailored suits and academic robes that surrounded her. Her face, framed by a cascade of untamed night-dark hair, was a study in quiet observation. Her eyes, the color of a forest floor, dappled with winter sunlight, missed nothing. They tracked Finch's every gesture, every self-satisfied smirk, but held no judgment, only a profound, unsettling calm. She had been invited here as a curiosity, a living exhibit. The wolf girl of the northern ridge, the feral child discovered only 2 years prior, now a ward of the state and a subject of intense scientific fascination. She was meant to be seen, studied, and ultimately dismissed. Finch gestured to the large screen behind him, where a sound wave visualization pulsed in jagged green lines. "What you are about to hear," he announced, his voice dripping with condescension, "is a recording of the Canis lupus pack from the very region our guest was recovered." A low murmur rippled through the audience. He let the drama hang in the air before continuing. Proponents of so-called animal language would have you believe this is a complex dialogue, a conversation, a transfer of specific actionable information. He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound like stones grinding together. "I want you to listen. Listen closely, and to hear it for what it is." He pressed a button on his remote. The hall was instantly flooded with sound. It was not mere howling. It was a complex, layered tapestry of noise, a series of sharp guttural barks, followed by a long, sorrowful howl that modulated in pitch, undercut by a sequence of low, rumbling growls and high-pitched yips. It was wild, alien, and to the ears of the assembled scholars, utterly chaotic. It was the sound of the wilderness, raw and untranslated. To Alara, it was the sound of home. A wave of profound, aching nostalgia washed over her. Every note, every cadence was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She could smell the crisp, pine-scented air of the high taiga. She could feel the press of warm, furry bodies huddled together against the biting wind. She could see Kael, the pack's aging alpha, his silver-muzzled face turned towards the rising moon, his great chest vibrating with the force of his call. This was not noise. It was a story. It was a warning. It was a history lesson and a prayer, all woven into one. When the recording clicked off, the silence it left behind was heavy, charged. Finch let it linger, a smug, triumphant smile playing on his lips. "Noise," he declared, the single word landing like a gavel. Primitive, instinctual vocalizations, a response to stimuli, yes, a demonstration of emotion perhaps. But language? A structured system of communication with syntax, grammar, and transferable abstract concepts? He laughed outright, a booming, arrogant sound that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. "The notion is absurd. It is a projection of our own human vanity. We see patterns where none exist. We seek intelligence in the grunts and squeals of beasts because we are lonely in our own cognitive castle." He paced the stage, his shadow looming large on the screen behind him. "Take our subject, Alara." He pointed a dismissive finger in her direction, not even gracing her with his gaze. The spotlight operator, following his cue, shifted a beam of harsh white light to illuminate her. Hundreds of pairs of eyes turned, pinning her in her seat. She did not flinch. She did not shrink away. She simply sat, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her expression unreadable. The light caught the unusual clarity of her eyes, making them seem to glow with an internal luminescence. The media, in its infinite thirst for sensation, has painted a romantic picture of a girl who talks to wolves, Finch scoffed. She has learned to mimic their sounds, of course. A clever parrot could do the same. But to suggest she understands them, that she converses with them, that is the anthropocentric fallacy in its most pathetic form. It is a fairy tale, gentlemen, a comforting lie we tell ourselves. He looked directly at Alara now, his eyes narrowing. It is a fraud. The room was utterly silent. The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It was a direct public assault, a professional and personal execution delivered on a stage of international repute. Alara felt the weight of every stare, the burning focus of the spotlight. She felt the collective judgment of a world that could not possibly comprehend hers. They saw a specimen, a wild thing barely tamed. They heard gibberish where she heard poetry. And then, something shifted within her. It was not anger, it was a deep, resonant clarity, a sense of duty. Kyle's voice from the recording echoed in her mind, not the sound, but the meaning. They do not listen, they do not see. They are blind in the light and deaf in the quiet. It was an old teaching, a warning about the two-legged creatures who occasionally wandered into their territory. For 2 years she had been patient. She had endured the tests, the scans, the endless questions from well-meaning but utterly ignorant scientists. She had remained quiet, honoring the pack's way. Observe, learn, and do not waste breath on those who cannot hear. But this was different. This was not just an attack on her. It was a desecration of her family, of their language, of their truth. Slowly, deliberately, Alara stood up. The movement was so fluid and silent it was almost unnerving. The spotlight followed her, casting her lone figure in stark relief against the shadowed audience. A gasp went through the room. No one challenged Dr. Finch. No one interrupted his sermons. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. It was soft, with a strange musical cadence, yet it carried to every corner of the immense hall. It cut through the oppressive silence like a shard of ice. "You are mistaken," she said. The words were simple, declarative. Finch froze mid-pace. He turned, his face a mask of disbelief, slowly twisting into a sneer of contempt. "Oh, what did you say, child?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You are mistaken," Alara repeated, her gaze unwavering. She met his eyes across the distance, and for the first time, Finch felt a flicker of something other than superiority. It was a disquieting sensation, like staring into the eyes of a creature far older and wiser than its form suggested. "It is not noise. It is a language. And I understand it." A wave of incredulous laughter, led by Finch himself, swept through the hall. It was a cruel, dismissive sound, the braying of a mob confident in its superiority. Finch threw his head back and roared. "You understand it?" he boomed, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "The little wolf girl speaks. And what, pray tell, were your furry brethren discussing? The price of caribou? The philosophical implications of the full moon?" The audience howled with him. The mockery was a physical force, a wave of ridicule that should have crushed her. But Alara stood like a stone in a raging river, unmoved. The laughter washed over her, and in its wake, only her quiet certainty remained. Paragraphs dash paragraphs. Her stillness infuriated Finch more than any outburst could have. He saw it as defiance, an insolent challenge to his ordained authority. His face, flushed with theatrical mirth, hardened into a mask of cold fury. The humor vanished, replaced by a chilling, predatory focus. He would not just defeat this girl, he would humiliate her. He would break her on the altar of his own intellect for all the world to see. "You claim to understand a language that does not exist," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing purr that was somehow more intimidating than his previous booming. A bold claim for a girl who until 2 years ago was living in a den and eating raw meat, but I am a man of science. I believe in empirical evidence. He turned to his console, his fingers flying across the keypad. "So let us put this talent of yours to the test." He was scrolling through a list of audio files, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He was not looking for a simple recording. He was looking for his ace in the hole. A piece of audio so complex, so layered, so utterly chaotic that no one, man or beast, could possibly decipher it. It was a recording his own team had labeled The Cacophony, a collection of overlapping vocalizations from multiple wolf packs engaged in a territorial dispute, recorded during a blizzard. It was a wall of sound, a sonic war. It was, he believed, the perfect trap. Contraband, he muttered with a smirk, selecting the file. This recording was not officially part of his research. It was deemed too messy, too unusable. It was his private collection of failures, and he was about to weaponize it. Let's see the wolf whisperer translate this. He cast a venomous look at Alara. Here is your stage, little oracle. Translate. Tell this esteemed audience exactly what the wolves are saying. He stabbed the play button. The sound that erupted from the speakers was a nightmare. It was a maelstrom of snarls, howls, barks, and growls, all crashing into each other. The distinct calls from the first recording were gone, replaced by a frantic, violent chaos. It was the audio equivalent of a battlefield. The audience physically recoiled. Even the most ardent believers in animal communication would have to concede this was nothing but primal rage. Finch crossed his arms, leaning back against his lectern, the very picture of smug certainty. He had her. There was no possible way she could spin this. She would have to admit defeat, and he would be magnanimous in his victory, pitying the poor, delusional child. But Alara did not look defeated. She closed her eyes. The harsh lights of the stage, the sea of staring faces, the oppressive judgment, it all faded away. She let the wall of sound wash over her, and where others heard chaos, she began to find structure. It was difficult, like trying to listen to a dozen different conversations in a crowded room at once, but it was not impossible. Her mind, forged in that very world, began to parse the threads. She isolated the deep resonant bark of an alpha, not Kale, another, younger, more aggressive one. That was the core thread. This is my territory. All who stand here are my meat. The challenge. Then, a second alpha's response, higher pitched, almost a shriek howl. You hunt on the graves of my ancestors. The mountain itself will reject you. The defense of sacred ground. She could hear the frantic yips of a subordinate pack member. The wind is turning. The snow spirit wakes. A warning about the worsening blizzard. She heard the low, mournful cry of a female. My pups are cold. The den is not safe. Fear, desperation, it was all there. A complex, brutal negotiation of territory, honor, and survival conducted in the middle of a life-threatening storm. It was a symphony of desperation. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, born not of humiliation, but of empathy. She was feeling their fear, their rage, their sorrow, all at once. In the fifth row, a young man watched, his brow furrowed. Dr. Aris Thorne was the youngest junior researcher at the Institute, a brilliant but idealistic linguist who had been assigned as Alara's academic liaison. Unlike the others, he wasn't looking at Alara as a subject. He had spent weeks with her, trying to teach her English grammar, and in return, had found himself learning a different kind of lesson in quiet dignity. He had seen the profound intelligence in her eyes, the way she understood complex concepts even when she lacked the words to express them. He saw the tear on her cheek. It wasn't the tear of a charlatan being exposed. It was a tear of genuine, profound emotion. He looked at Finch, preening on the stage, a vulture enjoying his kill. Then he looked back at Alara, standing alone, absorbing the hatred of the room, and he felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. This was not science. This was a public stoning. A memory, distant and fragmented, surfaced in his mind. A story his uncle used to tell, a story he'd always dismissed as a tall tale. His uncle, General Marcus Thorne, was a career military man, a no-nonsense leader of an elite special operations unit that specialized in search and rescue in extreme environments. Years ago, on a rescue mission in the Northern Ridge, they had been looking for a lost child. The story went that they were led to the child not by tracks, but by the local wolf pack. The wolves, his uncle had claimed with a dead serious face, had communicated with them, using a series of calls to guide their helicopter to a hidden ravine where the child lay injured, the child who had been living with them. Aris's blood ran cold. He looked at Alara, then back at the screen displaying the file name, NR_pack_conflict_blizzard_02. NR Northern Ridge. It couldn't be. He looked at Finch's smug face, at the academic mob baying for blood, and at Alara's quiet, heartbreaking sorrow. A fire ignited in his chest. It was the fire of moral outrage. He was a scientist. He was supposed to be a seeker of truth, and the truth, he suddenly felt with every fiber of his being, was not on that stage. It was standing in a spotlight, being crucified. Finch's voice boomed again, dripping with sarcasm. "Well? We are all waiting, Miss Doolittle. What profound wisdom do the beasts wish to impart this time? Is it a particularly scathing critique of my methods?" That was it. Eris couldn't be a spectator anymore. He had to do something, even if it meant the end of his career. He slipped his phone from his pocket, his hands trembling slightly. He had his uncle's private number, for emergencies only. He considered this an emergency. With his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, he stood up and began to walk, not towards the stage, but towards the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall. Every eye was on Alara. No one noticed the junior researcher slipping away into the marble-floored corridor. He found a quiet alcove, the sounds from the lecture hall muffled but still audible. He took a deep breath and dialed the number. It rang twice. "Thorne," a gruff, impatient voice answered. "Uncle Marcus, it's Eris," he said, his own voice sounding thin and reedy. "Eris? What is it? Is your mother all right?" "She's fine. I'm sorry to call you, but it's an emergency, I think." Eris struggled to find the words. "You know that story you used to tell? About the rescue in the northern ridge? The girl and the wolves?" There was a sudden dead silence on the other end of the line. The impatience in the general's voice was replaced by something else, something cold and sharp. "That story is not for public consumption, Eris. It's classified. What about it?" "She's here," Eris whispered, his voice cracking. "The girl. Her name is Alara. She's at the Institute, and they're destroying her. A man named Finch. He's publicly humiliating her. He's calling her a fraud. He's playing recordings of her pack and calling it noise." Another silence, longer this time. Eris could almost hear the gears turning in his uncle's mind, the tumblers of a long-locked vault clicking into place. When the general spoke again, his voice was transformed. It was no longer the voice of his uncle. It was the voice of a commander in the field. It was steel. "Where exactly are you, Eris?" "The main symposium hall at the Institute on Grand Avenue. Stay there. Do not engage. Do not interfere. Just watch her. Keep her safe. I'm on my way." The line went dead. Eris stood in the corridor, his phone still pressed to his ear, a profound sense of terror and relief washing over him. He had just called in an airstrike on a turf war he had no business being in. He had no idea what his uncle would do, but he knew one thing for certain. The keynote speech of Dr. Alistair Finch was about to be interrupted. Inside the hall, Alara finally opened her eyes. The tear had dried on her cheek. The storm of sound had passed through her, and she had emerged on the other side, holding its meaning in her mind like a precious, fragile stone. She looked at Finch, whose smug expression was beginning to curdle into impatience. "The silence is deafening, isn't it?" Finch mocked. "Cat got your tongue? Or perhaps I should say wolf?" Alara took a soft breath. "It is not silence," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It is a tragedy." Before she could say more, before Finch could unleash his next volley of scorn, a sound from the outside world intruded. It was faint at first, a rhythmic chopping that grew steadily louder, closer. A few people in the audience glanced towards the high, arched windows, frowning. The sound was insistent, growing in volume until it was a physical presence, a deep, percussive thump-thump-thump that vibrated through the floor, rattling the glass in the window frames. It was the sound of a heavy-lift military helicopter, and it was not passing by. It was hovering directly over the building. Finch's face, for the first time, showed a crack in its perfect veneer of arrogance. He looked up at the ceiling as if expecting the rotors to tear through the roof. "What in God's name is that?" he snapped, his composure finally fraying. The answer came not from the sky, but from the rear of the hall. The grand oak doors, which had been closed for the duration of the lecture, were flung open with a deafening crash that echoed like a thunderclap. They slammed against the marble walls, the sound an act of pure, unapologetic power. Framed in the doorway stood three figures. The man in the center was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a granite landscape of command, his silver hair cropped short in a severe military cut. He wore the immaculate dress uniform of a general of the United States Army, his chest a dazzling constellation of medals and ribbons that told a silent story of decades spent in the world's most dangerous places. His eyes, the same piercing shade of gray as his nephew's, swept the room with an expression of absolute Arctic authority. On either side of him stood two military aides, their uniforms equally pristine, their postures rigid, their faces utterly devoid of expression. They were not men. They were extensions of the general's will. The room went silent. Not the respectful silence Finch had commanded, but a new kind of silence. It was a vacuum, a void created by the sudden shocking intrusion of a power so immense and so alien to their world that it defied comprehension. The low hum of the projector, the rustle of papers, the sound of breathing, it all ceased. Time itself seemed to have frozen. Finch stood on the stage, his mouth slightly agape, looking like a pompous actor who had forgotten his lines in the middle of a play that had just been canceled. General Marcus Thorne did not so much as glance at the man on the stage. His gaze swept past him as if he were a piece of furniture. His eyes scanned the audience, found the lone figure in the spotlight, and locked onto her. The three men began to walk down the central aisle. Their steps were not hurried. They were measured, deliberate, the rhythmic tap of their polished dress shoes on the marble floor, the only sound in the universe. It was a sound that radiated power, a sound that announced the arrival of judgment. The academics and students in their path seemed to shrink into their seats, pulling their limbs in, making themselves small, as if to avoid being touched by the gravitational field of the men walking past. The procession was inexorable. It was a force of nature. They did not stop until they reached the front row, directly below the lip of the stage where Alara stood. General Thorne halted, his aides stopping a half-step behind him in perfect synchronized motion. He looked up at Alara. The harsh, analytical glare of the spotlight softened as it reflected in his eyes. The hard lines of his face seemed to melt away, replaced by something ancient and deeply respectful. He brought his heels together with a sharp, clean click. He raised his right hand in a slow, precise, and profoundly reverent salute, the white glove a stark slash against the dark blue of his uniform. The gesture was not for the audience. It was not for the institute. It was for her and her alone. Her. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble of gravel and honor. It filled the silent hall, not with academic theory, but with unshakable truth. Guardian of the Northern Ridge, he said, the title echoing with a history none in the room could comprehend. It is an honor to see you again. Alara looked down at the uniformed giant, at the man who had pulled her from the wreckage of a life she had loved, and she gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, a greeting between two sovereigns from different worlds. Finch, on the stage, finally found his voice. It was a strangled, incredulous squawk. "General, what is the meaning of this intrusion? I am in the middle of a keynote address. This is a private academic symposium." General Thorne lowered his salute, but he did not turn to face Finch. He kept his eyes locked on Alara, as if she were the only person in the room who mattered. "Dr. Finch," he said, the name sounding like an insult on his tongue, "your keynote address is over." Then, finally, he turned his head slowly, deliberately, and pinned Finch with a gaze so cold it could have frozen fire. "You are speaking on matters about which you know nothing. You are using research materials that are not yours, and you are publicly harassing a civilian who is under the indirect protection of the United States Armed Forces." Funich's face went from flushed red to a pasty, sickly white. "Protection? Research materials? What are you talking about? She's a feral child. The recordings are from my own field work." "Are they?" the general countered, his voice lethally soft. "Are you certain your team didn't happen to stumble upon a restricted military research zone in the Northern Ridge, a zone where my unit has been conducting a long-term study for over a decade, a study into advanced non-human linguistics?" The blood drained completely from Finch's face. He staggered back a step, his hand finding the lectern for support. The word fraud, which he had so casually thrown at Alara, now hung in the air like a guillotine blade directly above his own head. Thorne took a step towards the stage, his presence utterly commanding. He turned to address the stunned, silent audience. His voice was no longer soft. It was the voice of command, a voice used to sending men into battle, a voice that tolerated no argument. "For 12 years, he began, his voice ringing with authority, my unit has been operating a clandestine research project designated Project Echo. The objective? To study the vocalization patterns of the alpha wolf packs in the northern ridge, which have demonstrated a level of communicative complexity that defies all existing zoological models. This is not theory. It is battlefield-tested fact." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. 14 years ago, a small aircraft went down in that territory. There was one survivor, a 3-year-old girl. Search and rescue operations failed. She was declared lost. But she wasn't lost. She was found. She was adopted. She was protected and raised by the very subjects of our study, the alpha pack of the northern ridge. He pointed a gloved finger, not at Alara, but at the frozen waveform on the screen behind Finch. 2 years ago, during a territorial conflict that threatened to decimate the packs, the very cacophony you were so smugly playing, Doctor, the alpha of the pack, a magnificent creature we called Kyle, did something unprecedented. He broke from the conflict. He led my team, my men, on a 3-day journey through impassable terrain to a hidden den. He used a series of specific, repeated, and directional calls to guide our helicopters. Calls that were not noise, but were in fact coordinates, directions, a plea. The general's gaze fell on Alara once more, and his voice softened again, filled with a raw, undeniable reverence. Inside that den we found her. She was 15 years old. She was suffering from severe pneumonia, and the pack could not heal her. They did the only thing they could. They surrendered their most precious member to us, their historical enemies, to save her life. They spoke to us in the only language they had, and we, thankfully, had learned just enough to listen. This young woman is not a feral child. She is a survivor. She is a linguist of a language no one else on this planet speaks fluently. She is the living keeper of a library of knowledge we are only just beginning to comprehend. She is a hero who protected her family and whose family protected her. You, Dr. Finch, have stood on this stage and called her a fraud. The only fraud in this room, sir, is you. The monologue was devastating. It was a tactical nuke detonated in the heart of Finch's world. It didn't just discredit him, it annihilated him, erasing his legacy and salting the earth where it once stood. Finch stood trembling, his mouth opening and closing silently, no sound coming out. He looked like a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. His meticulously constructed reality had been dismantled, piece by piece, by a power he could not fight, using a truth he had been too arrogant to see. General Thorne turned his back on the broken man. He looked up at Alara. "The floor is yours, Guardian," he said softly. "I believe you were about to offer a translation." All eyes, no longer filled with mockery but with a dawning horrified awe, turned back to Alara. The spotlight was no longer a tool of interrogation. It was a halo. She stood in its beam, a figure of impossible grace and authority. She took another soft breath, the sound impossibly loud in the tomb-like silence. "It is a tragedy," she repeated, her voice resonating with the sorrow of the sounds she had heard. She looked past Finch, past the audience, her gaze fixed on a distant point in her memory, her voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller reciting an ancient epic poem. "The black fur alpha of the river pack lays claim to the Sunstone Ridge. He says the spirits of the stone have promised it to his pups. This is a lie. He is young and his pack is starving. He acts from fear, not strength." She paused and the entire room held its breath. Her translation was not a simple, literal one. It was imbued with context, with emotion, with the deep cultural knowledge that Finch had declared impossible. "The Silverback Alpha, Kale's son, whose name is Lauren, denies the claim. He says the Sunstone Ridge is the birthing ground of his pack, a sacred place. He says the bones of his grandmother are buried beneath the stone and give it its warmth. He warns the Blackfur that the mountain itself will bleed before it is surrendered." Her voice dropped, becoming heavy with foreboding. "The Wind Watcher of the Silverback Pack cries a warning. The blizzard is not a normal storm. It is a sky serpent, a white hurricane. He says it will not pass for 3 days and that the valley will be buried. He pleads with Lauren to seek shelter in the deep caves, to abandon the ridge. But Lauren is bound by honor. He will not retreat. She looked down, her own eyes mirroring the pain she was describing. A female from the river pack, the black fur's mate, is crying. Her call is faint, almost lost in the storm. She is not with the warriors. She is trapped with her newborn pups in a den near the river. The ice is breaking up. She is calling for help, but her alpha cannot hear her over the sound of his own pride. Alara fell silent. She had not just translated the sounds. She had painted a vivid, heartbreaking portrait of a complex drama. It was Shakespeare in howls and growls. It was a story of pride, fear, duty, and impending doom. The cacophony was, in fact, an opera. The silence that followed was profound. It was a silence of shock, of shame, of reevaluation. In that moment, every person in the room understood the depth of their ignorance. They had laughed at a eulogy. They had mocked a prayer. The director of the institute, a portly man named Dr. Albright, who had been beaming at Finch's side just minutes before, scrambled to his feet. He rushed to the side of the stage, his face pale and sweating. "General Thorne, my deepest, most profound apologies. We had no idea. This is an astonishing revelation." He turned to Finch, his face contorted with fury. "Finch, you are finished. Your tenure is revoked. Your research grants are suspended, pending an investigation into academic fraud and misuse of classified intelligence. Get off that stage. Get out of my institute." Finch didn't seem to hear him. He was staring at Alara, his eyes wide with a dawning horror that had nothing to do with his career. It was the horror of a man who has built his entire world on a foundation of sand and has just felt the first tremor of the earthquake that will swallow him whole. Two figures detached themselves from the back of the hall. They were not academics. They were military police, their presence requested by General Thorne with the same quiet efficiency with which he did everything. They walked up the stage steps, their movements calm and professional. They flanked the trembling Dr. Finch. One of them spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Dr. Alistair Finch, you'll need to come with us, sir." Finch didn't resist. He seemed to have shrunk, the grand, imposing figure, now a stooped, pathetic old man in a tweed jacket. As they led him away, past the silent, staring rows of his former acolytes, his gaze remained fixed on Alara. His empire had crumbled. His name was ruined, but the most devastating blow was the simple, undeniable truth he saw in her eyes. He had not been wrong about a theory. He had been wrong about reality itself. General Thorne walked up the small set of stairs onto the stage. He moved to Alara's side, placing himself between her and the audience, a silent, uniformed guardian. He did not address the crowd. He spoke only to her, his voice low and gentle. "My nephew, Aris, was right to call. I'm sorry it came to this. We should have done more to protect you from this world." Alara looked at him, her expression not one of triumph, but of a deep, weary sadness. "This world does not listen," she said softly. "It only talks." "Then we will have to teach it how to listen," the general replied, his voice firm with resolve. He gestured to his nephew, Aris, who was now standing near the front, his face a mixture of terror and elation. "Aris will be your liaison from now on. The full resources of Project Echo are at your disposal. We will build a new institute, a better one founded on respect, not arrogance." He then turned to the still stunned director Albright. "You will issue a full public retraction of this entire symposium's premise. You will issue a formal apology to Ms. Alara, and you will cooperate fully with our investigation. Is that understood?" Albright nodded frantically, stammering, "Yes, General, of course, anything. We are honored, truly horrified and honored." General Thorne ignored his fawning. He turned back to Alara, offering her his arm as gallantly as a knight to his queen. "Let's get you out of here," he said gently. Alara looked at the offered arm for a moment, a symbol of a world she did not understand. Then, instead of taking it, she simply walked past him, her steps as silent and sure as they had been when she first stood up. The general smiled faintly, a flicker of deep respect in his eyes, and fell into step beside her. Together, flanked by the stoic aides, they walked down the central aisle and out through the shattered doors, leaving behind a world that was forever changed and a silence filled with the echoes of a language it had finally, devastatingly, begun to hear. The fallout was immediate and absolute. The story of the symposium became an international sensation, but not in the way Finch had envisioned. News outlets, initially drawn by the Wolf Girl spectacle, now reported a stunning tale of academic fraud, military secrets, and the vindication of a silent, watchful young woman. Dr. Alistair Finch was not just fired, he was erased. His publications were retracted amid scandals of plagiarized data and fabricated conclusions. The classified intelligence charge stuck, as General Thorne's legal team demonstrated that Finch's research team had repeatedly and illegally bypassed warning beacons around the Project Echo perimeter, using long-range microphones to capture the very recordings he presented as his own. He avoided treason charges, but was sentenced to 5 years in a federal prison for theft of government property and violations of the National Security Act. His name became a cautionary tale in academia, a synonym for hubris. In the wake of the scandal, the International Linguistics Institute was gutted and reformed. Director Albright was forced into an early ignominious retirement. In his place, a new board was established, and with a joint grant from the Department of Defense and a consortium of chastened universities, the Thorne-Alara Institute for Interspecies Communication was born. It was housed in a new, state-of-the-art facility, not in the heart of a bustling city, but on the edge of the vast national park that bordered the northern ridge. Its mission was not to impose human understanding on the natural world, but to learn from it. Eris Thorne, no longer a junior researcher but a foundational member of the new institute, thrived. The shadow of his uncle's reputation gave him authority, but it was his own genuine respect for Alara and her world that earned him his place. He worked tirelessly, not as Alara's keeper, but as her student and her ambassador. He helped her document the complex grammatical and syntactical rules of the wolf language, which they formally named Lupine Sylvan, or the Forest Tongue. Their first co-authored paper, Syntax and Social Structure in Lupine Sylvan Vocalization, sent shockwaves through the scientific community, ushering in a new era of biological linguistics. Alara herself never sought the spotlight. She retreated from the clamor of the human world as soon as she was able. She found her home at the new institute, but not in its sterile labs. A special enclosure, miles wide, was created for her, a pristine swath of forest and mountain that was an exact replica of her home territory. With the help of the general's resources, the surviving members of her pack, including the aging Loran, his mate, and their pups, were carefully and peacefully relocated there. The river pack, shattered after the blizzard and the loss of their alpha, was integrated into the new, larger community. The tragedy she had translated had found a quiet, peaceful resolution. She spent her days there, in the quiet companionship of her family, her true family. She was no longer a subject, but the lead researcher. She communicated with Aris and his team through a series of remote audio links and occasional quiet visits. She was the bridge, the one soul who could stand with a foot in each world. She taught them not just the language of the wolves, but their philosophy, the intricate balance of community and individuality, the sacredness of territory, the unforgiving laws of survival, and the profound unspoken bonds of loyalty. She never showed triumph or bitterness. Her vindication was not in Finch's downfall, but in the simple fact that her family was safe, and their voices were finally being heard with respect. Years passed. The world moved on. Alistair Finch was released from prison, a broken and forgotten man. The tweed jacket was long gone, replaced by worn, ill-fitting clothes. The resonant, commanding voice was now a frail, hesitant whisper. He lived in a small, drab apartment, his days spent in obscurity, haunted by the ghost of the man he once was. The academic world he had once ruled had blacklisted him so completely that he couldn't even get a job as a substitute teacher. His life was a quiet, lonely penance. One autumn afternoon, he took a bus to the edge of the national park. He walked for miles until he reached the perimeter fence of the Thorne-Alara Institute's vast forest sanctuary. He stood there for a long time, a stooped figure against the vibrant colors of the fall foliage. He had written a letter, a desperate, rambling plea for a meeting, and to his astonishment, it had been granted. A gate buzzed open, and Aris Thorne met him there. Aris looked older, his face etched with the quiet confidence of a man who had found his life's work. He regarded Finch not with hatred, but with a kind of clinical pity. "She agreed to see you," Aris said simply. "Don't make her regret it." He led Finch not to a building, but along a simple dirt path into the woods. After a 10-minute walk, they came to a small clearing. Alara was there, sitting on a fallen log, watching a pair of young wolves play fighting in the distance. She was no longer a girl. She was a woman, her face retaining its ageless calm, her eyes holding the deep quiet wisdom of the forest itself. She wore the same simple, functional clothes, and she looked completely at peace. Finch stopped at the edge of the clearing, his heart pounding. This was the woman he had tried to destroy, the icon he had unwittingly created. He had replayed that day in the symposium 1,000 times in his mind, the memory a source of unending torment. He began, his voice cracking. He had rehearsed a speech, an eloquent apology full of regret and self-flagellation, but looking at her now, in her element, so utterly beyond his world of ambition and ego, the words felt hollow and false. He fell to his knees, the damp earth soaking through his thin trousers. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words raw, stripped of all artifice. "I was wrong. I was a fool, blinded by pride. I didn't just disrespect you. I committed a sin against the truth. I don't ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I needed to say it. To you." Alara watched him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The young wolves, sensing a strange tension, stopped their play and looked over, their golden eyes curious. Alara made a soft chuffing sound, a sound of reassurance, and they went back to their tumbling. She finally turned her gaze back to the kneeling man. "Forgiveness is not a word in the forest tongue," she said, her voice as calm and clear as a mountain stream. "There is only action and consequence. You acted from pride. Your consequence was ruin. That is the balance." Finch bowed his head, accepting the verdict. Is there any way to change the consequence? To find a new balance?" he asked, his voice thick with desperation. Alara was silent for a time, watching the wind move through the pines. "The pack does not forgive a lone wolf who challenges the alpha and loses," she said finally. "But sometimes, if he survives his exile, if he learns humility, if he brings back food and asks for nothing, he may be allowed to eat at the edge of the circle. He is never trusted again, but he is not left to starve." She stood up, her movement fluid and silent. "Your world values words. My world values action. What you do now is what matters, not what you say." Without another word, she turned and walked away, melting back into the trees, the two young wolves trotting happily at her heels. She did not look back. Finch remained on his knees for a long time, the weight of her words settling over him. It was not the easy absolution he might have craved, nor the condemnation he probably deserved. It was something harder and more profound. It was a path, a difficult, lonely path with no promise of reward. A path to redemption not through forgiveness, but through quiet, humble action. He eventually rose, his old bones aching, and walked back the way he came. He did not know what he would do, but as he left the forest, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Beneath the crushing weight of his shame, there was a tiny, fragile flicker. It was the faintest glimmer of purpose. He had been given a new balance to find. It was the last, and perhaps most important, lesson the wolf girl of the northern ridge would ever teach him. And this time, he was finally ready to listen.